I didn't ease into this. HOA Karen tried to take my land by force, and the morning she declared my farm a public dog park, I made a quiet decision that ended her authority completely. She believed she owned my property, my time, and even my roads. She didn't realize every path she needed already belonged to me. She built a playground on my soil and tried to crown herself queen, but she walked straight into a place where I control every entrance and every exit. There was no warm-up, no negotiation, no polite back and forth. She went to war over what I own, and I closed the only ways out. The first moment I saw the sign they'd planted, it wasn't confusion I felt. It was clarity. A fresh, newly printed banner stretched between two metal stakes at the edge of my north pasture, flapping in the wind like a taunt. Crestwood Community Dog Park open to public. Beneath it stood HOA Karen, that red blazer like a warning flare, sunglasses reflecting my fields like she already held the deed. Fake authority radiated off her, like heat off asphalt. There were cars lined along my fence, strangers unloading coolers, kids letting dogs off leashes to trample my alfalfa. Not one of them had permission to be there. Karen raised her voice the second she saw me step out of my truck. "This area is now community property," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, as if volume could rewrite law. "And you are trespassing on HOA-managed land." She didn't waver, didn't blink, didn't hesitate. It was the confidence of someone who had gotten away with this kind of thing too many times. She expected me to argue. She expected me to beg. She expected me to fold the way frightened homeowners do when a letter shows up covered in seals and legal words. I didn't give her any of that. I just looked at her and said calmly, "You've made a mistake you can't walk out of." She smirked like she'd already won. She had officers again, the same brand of rental costume muscle she'd used before, uniforms that only looked official from far away. Clipboards, radios, no badge numbers. They stood behind her like stage props. All performance, no legitimacy. Karen lifted a stack of papers and started reciting phrases she didn't understand. Easement rights, public good designation, emergency rezoning. She was stringing together legal words like beads, hoping the shape would scare me. I let her finish. Then I told her the fact that ended the game before she even realized there was one. "All access roads are mine," I said. Her smile faltered. I pointed down the gravel lane the crowd had driven in on. "That one. Private. Recorded deed." Then to the dirt track, looping behind the barn. "Private." Then to the utility path, winding toward the ridge. "Private." Every route they had used to reach my land started and ended with me. She had built a public park with no legal entrance. It hit her in pieces. First the slight narrowing of her eyes, then the throat swallow she tried to hide. Then the turn of her head as she looked back at the lines of parked cars she could no longer legally leave without my permission. The people who had followed her there started to sense it too. Murmurs, uneasy shifting, dogs tugging on leashes no one suddenly felt confident holding. "You can't block people in," she snapped finally, clinging to the last bit of false certainty. "This is harassment." "No," I said, voice low. "This is private property, and every tire on it is trespassing." I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. I didn't move any closer than I already was. I didn't need to. Real authority doesn't chase. It waits. One of her fake officers stepped forward, puffing his chest because he thought that's what power looked like. "Ma'am, we can have him removed," he muttered, trying to sound official. Karen latched onto it immediately, because she needed the illusion even more than the land. "Remove him," she ordered. No one moved. The moment hung there, fragile and sharp. Everyone could feel it. Whatever she thought she controlled, it wasn't responding to her anymore. She called it a park. I called it my backyard. And my voice carried more weight than every piece of paper she held. I took out my phone and spoke one sentence loud enough for the nearest cameras to catch. "Sheriff has been notified that a crowd has been led onto private agricultural land by a person impersonating authority. Not a threat, a report." Karen's face drained even as she tried to keep it composed. She said my name like it was a slur. "You won't get away with this," I answered without raising my voice. "You brought them here. Now they have to explain why they're here." People started quietly leashing dogs again. Coolers were shut. Car doors opened and closed with that guilty, hurried sound people make when they suddenly realize they are somewhere they were never meant to be. Karen tried to rally them. She lifted her hands, called out words like rights and community and access, but the crowd's confidence had been rented from her, and the lease was expiring in real time. The first engine started, then another, but there was nowhere to go without using my roads, and now everyone knew it. You could see the realization pass through them like a wind shift before a storm. Every exit they needed was owned by the man they had been told had no say at all. I leaned against my truck like I had all the time in the world, calm, unmoved, watching the woman who tried to take everything realize she now controlled nothing. She walked right up to me, close enough for me to see the crack forming in her perfect red lipstick. "If you don't open those roads," she whispered, "you'll regret it." Her voice didn't match her words. There was tremor where confidence used to be. I answered the same way I've answered bullies my entire life. "No, Karen, you regret this." She stepped back, like the ground shifted. For the first time, she wasn't performing. She was processing. My land, my gates, my roads. She had thought property was just dirt. She forgot it comes with borders, and borders are power. The sirens were faint at first, then clearer as they wound toward us. Real authority, real law. Not the kind she printed out of her home office and stamped with a logo she invented in her kitchen. When the patrol trucks rolled up, people stopped pretending they were at a grand opening. Karen started talking fast, shoving papers forward like shields, throwing terms at the deputies as if enough syllables could turn fiction into law. They didn't even take the pages from her hand. They walked the fence line. They checked the posted deed markers. They listened while I explained calmly what she had done. Then they turned to her. The deputy didn't raise his voice either. "Ma'am, you've brought the public onto private land without any lawful authority, and you've attempted to designate it for use you do not control." The words landed like verdicts. Short, unemotional, final. She tried to interrupt. He kept talking. "You will remove all signage. You will leave this property, and you will notify every person you invited that this land is not, and has never been, yours to manage." That was the first time she went silent. Not dramatic, not screaming, just empty. She finally understood. I didn't need to argue with her. I didn't need to outshout her. I didn't need to convince anyone of anything. I just had to stand there while the truth did the work. The crowd dispersed slowly, forced to take the same roads they'd arrived on. My roads. The ones she thought didn't matter when she was busy drawing lines on stolen maps. Every car that rolled away was a reminder that all of her power had depended on a lie I refused to believe. She stood there last, red suit now looking less like armor and more like a costume someone forgot to return. She looked at me like she hated me for not braking. I looked back without saying a word. She climbed into her car like someone walking off a stage after realizing the audience had stopped clapping an hour ago. Tires rolled over my gravel, slow, defeated, the sound of retreat. But even as she left, I knew something important. She wasn't finished. People like HOA Karen don't stop when they're wrong. They stop when they're cornered. And today, all she discovered was that the fences she wanted to tear down were stronger than she expected. Tomorrow she would learn that the person standing behind them was stronger too. As the last vehicle disappeared and the wind finally moved freely across the pasture again, the banner snapped one last time before I tore it down. The dogs were gone, the people were gone, but the insult lingered in the air. She had come onto land carved by my family's hands and tried to rename it like history was optional. I gathered the broken stakes, the trash they left, the fake notices taped to my gate, stacking them slowly, deliberately, the way you stack evidence. Because from the first moment she called my home a public park, I wasn't just angry. I was focused. She thought she'd embarrassed me. She believed paper beat ownership. She was wrong on all counts. As sunset burned the edges of the fields and the last of the dust settled, one fact stood unshaken beneath everything she'd tried to stage. This land is mine. Every road into it is mine, and every path away from it is mine. She built her fantasy park inside boundaries she didn't control, and the next time she tried to walk back in, I would be waiting. She thought the sign was the beginning of her empire. She had no idea it was just the latest trespass in a long line of attempts to claim what she never earned. To understand how confidently she walked onto my fields like she was cutting a ribbon at her own ceremony, you have to understand the history she tried to erase with a banner and a smirk. This farm is not a hobby. It is a bloodline. My grandfather broke this ground with his hands. My father held it together through storms and debt. And I took it through the years when everyone else said agriculture was dying. Every fence post on this land has a story. Every tree line is a boundary set before Karen ever learned what an HOA even was. She saw acreage. I saw heritage. She saw opportunity. I saw responsibility. That is the difference between someone who prints power and someone who earns it. My authority didn't come from a board meeting. It came from decades of waking up before the sun and going to bed after the work was done. She filed fake documents. I filed tax returns, harvest records, water rights renewals, and real deeds stamped with real seals by people who actually exist. She called herself president. I called myself owner because that title is proven, not declared, and that is exactly why she hated me on sight. People like HOA Karen cannot stand people whose existence doesn't depend on them. The first time I ever heard her name was months before the dog park stunt. A neighbor stopped me at the feed store and laughed under his breath when I mentioned Crestwood Valley. "Careful," he said. "That's Karen's kingdom." I thought he was joking. He wasn't. She'd built herself into a local tyrant in a pressed blazer, the kind who smiled in community photos while strangling people with paperwork off camera. And when Crestwood ran out of fences to measure and lawns to inspect, she started looking outward, across my fence line, across my fields. Expansion. That word had been floating around the county for months. I ignored it at first, because noise only matters when backed by law. Hers wasn't. But then the mail started arriving, not addressed to Garrett Farm, addressed to future Crestwood community property. I held each envelope like an insult and set it aside. She wasn't knocking. She was announcing her intention to kick the door in. I didn't respond because you don't answer to someone who has no jurisdiction over you. That silence infuriated her. Control addicts read calm as defiance. She sent notices threatening fines she had no right to impose. She scheduled hearings before boards that didn't exist outside the walls of her meeting room. She used legal tone like a weapon and expected me to flinch. I didn't. I kept working my land while she built her fantasy government. And each time she failed to get a reaction, she escalated. That's what brought her to my pasture with fake officers and a banner. She thought showing up in person would intimidate me where letters had failed. She believed that authority was performance, that if she stood tall enough and spoke sharply enough, reality would adjust itself to her script. She didn't understand I'd lived a life where real authority either works or breaks. I grew up watching my father wear an actual badge, one that carried actual weight, not because of metal but because of the oath behind it. He taught me early that titles mean nothing without jurisdiction, and jurisdiction is carved in law, not laminated in a home office. When he walked onto land, people straightened, not because they were scared of him, but because they respected what he represented. Karen demanded fear because she knew respect wasn't available to her. That difference was carved into every move she made. My background isn't just farming. Before I came back to run this place full-time, I spent years working cases that dealt with land disputes, property fraud, and boundary conflicts. I've seen how fast a forged paper can ruin a family. I've watched smooth talkers try to turn technicalities into leverage. I've seen everything she tried. So when she thought she'd discovered some loophole to call my field's community recreation space, she was just replaying tricks I'd already learned how to dismantle. She underestimated me because I don't advertise my experience. To her, I looked like a farmer with dirt under my nails and a truck that's seen better paint. She didn't see the training, the patience, or the ability to take things apart quietly and thoroughly. She mistook simplicity for weakness. That was her first mistake. Her second mistake was assuming isolation. She believed I stood alone out here because she only understands strength when it's stacked in rows of chairs at board meetings. She forgot that small towns talk, sheriffs remember, clerks keep records, and that every path she took to get to my land left a traceable mark. Authority, real authority, is quiet because it doesn't need to shout. It shows up in the form of county plats, jurisdiction maps, filed easement agreements that she pretended didn't exist, but I have organized, stamped, and preserved. I didn't need to invent anything to beat her. I only needed to present what already was. And yet, despite all of that, she still convinced herself she could absorb my farm into her imaginary empire. Why? Because for years no one had told her no in a way that stuck. She'd built her identity out of compliance. She'd write a notice, people would pay. She'd make a threat, people would fold. She'd hint at legal trouble, and neighbors would mow, paint, and rebuild whatever she pointed at. She mistook exhaustion for obedience. She believed fear was loyalty. She convinced herself she was right, simply because no one wanted to fight. I wasn't raised that way. On this land, we were taught that silence has a time limit, and that when someone crosses your boundary line, you don't scream, you enforce. That is the mentality she ran into when she picked the wrong property to rename. Standing on my field that day, she saw only opposition. What she didn't see was history standing behind me. Every generation that refused to let someone else define what they already owned. And because she couldn't see it, she disrespected it. That is what turned this from irritation into resolve. I didn't go looking for a battle with an HOA president. I didn't care about her meetings or her newsletters or the way she micromanaged the shade of people's shutters. But the second she stepped onto my land with signs, lies, and a crowd she'd manipulated into participating, she crossed the line from nuisance into threat. And threats get handled, not theatrically, methodically. She believed she'd humiliate me by calling my property public. She didn't know she'd only given me every piece of rope she needed, wrapped neatly in a folder labeled evidence. Because despite the noise she made, everything came down to one simple truth she couldn't rewrite. No matter how many papers she waved, this farm doesn't answer to her. It never did. It answers to the law, the land records, and the names signed on the deed decades before she ever imagined herself powerful. She wanted to be the central figure in this story. She wasn't. She was just another person who learned too late that pretending to be in charge works right up until you meet someone who actually is. HOA Karen didn't rule with intelligence. She ruled with intimidation wrapped in paperwork and performed confidence. Crestwood Valley wasn't a neighborhood. It was a stage where she played judge, jury, and executioner for anyone who parked a truck wrong or planted their wrong color flowers. And like every petty regime, her power structure wasn't built on strength. It was built on people too tired to argue anymore. She didn't call it control. She called it community standards. She didn't call it fines. She called it compliance incentives. She didn't call it harassment. She called it oversight. But strip away the polished language, and there it was a woman who discovered you can frighten far more people with official-looking paper than with force. Her board wasn't a council. It was a shield. She surrounded herself with yes people whose greatest qualification wasn't competence, but obedience. A retired realtor who missed telling people what their house was worth. A banker who loved feeling like the gatekeeper of other people's money. A former city clerk who still craved the taste of small authority. Together they formed a circle around her, echoing whatever she said, voting how she told them to, pretending they had power while she pulled every string. And because they got to sit at the table, they believed they were important. That's how she trapped them. She made them feel chosen, and in return they signed whatever she slid across the desk. She ran Crestwood like a private monarchy with meeting minutes. Every rule revision passed because they were too scared to oppose her. Every fine issued because they liked being on the side that wasn't being punished. Not once did any of them think to ask whether they actually had the legal right to do what they were doing. They didn't need legality as long as people paid. Fear was the currency, and Karen printed it daily. I learned early in my investigation just how deep her reach had crept. She had created committees with titles that sounded government-issued, but weren't worth the ink on the paper. Community Compliance Task Force, Residential Harmony Oversight Division, Crestwood Environmental Review Panel. Residents received letters from these fabricated bodies and assumed they were real simply because they were exhausted and didn't want trouble. That exhaustion was her greatest weapon. Over time, she trained the entire neighborhood to flinch at envelopes. They stopped questioning. They just paid. She exploited good people's desire for peace and turned it into a personal revenue stream. She even had her own fake law enforcement light operation. Not real officers, not deputies, just rent-a-uniform men she called Community Patrol, who drove slowly through the streets writing down license plates like spies in a low-budget movie. Their job wasn't protection. It was visibility. Their presence said, "We're watching you." And in neighborhoods like Crestwood, The feeling of being watched is enough to make people fall in line. She turned neighbors against each other with anonymous reporting hotlines. One phone call, one complaint submitted through her little online portal, and suddenly someone had a notice taped to their door demanding repainting, removal, or payment. And she always made sure those notices sounded final. No appeal, no warmth, just threats decorated with legal terminology she barely understood. She studied how people respond to formatting. Bold letters, uppercase law citations, phrases like, "Failure to comply may result in legal action." The words didn't matter as much as the weight they suggested. She didn't just enforce rules, she manufactured violations to justify her existence. One man hung a wind chime on his porch. She fined him for noise disturbance. A mother chalked drawings with her daughter on the sidewalk. Karen called it defacement. Another family parked their RV in their own driveway for one weekend while packing for a trip. She threatened to lien their house. None of those people were fighters. They had jobs, kids, lives. They didn't want conflict, so they paid and stayed quiet. That silence became her proof that she was right. That silence is how every petty tyrant grows. She built files on people, literal folders labeled with names and behavior patterns. I saw them later. Some had pictures of houses with circles drawn around things she didn't like. Garden gnomes, basketball hoops, flags. She called it documentation. I called it obsession. And then she ran out of playground. Crestwood had been wrung dry. She'd extracted every fine, every ounce of compliance, every piece of emotional submission she could from the people that trapped in her gates. That's when she looked across the fence at my land and saw her next campaign. That dog park wasn't about dogs. It wasn't about families or community or health initiatives. It was about expansion. It was about taking something big, old, rooted, and independent, and bending it until it broke beneath her rules. She saw my farm as acreage without a voice. No HOA meetings, no resident votes, no newsletter. To her, that looked like neglected land waiting to be absorbed. She didn't see that my land already had protection stronger than any board she could manufacture: recorded deeds, generational rights, county jurisdiction, and a man who knew exactly how every legal lever actually works. She didn't research those parts. Karen never researches things that get in the way of what she wants. She only reads long enough to find a sentence she can twist. That's how she justified building on property that wasn't hers with forms that weren't valid, signed by people who didn't exist, under organizations that dissolved years ago. She lived inside a fantasy where paperwork replaces property rights. She thought if she announced it, posted it, printed it, then the world had to catch up and call it real. Most people she dealt with didn't know how to fight back. They didn't know which office to call, which code to cite, which step to take without accidentally making something worse. I did. And that made me the most dangerous thing in Karen's world, a calm man with proof. When she built that dog park entrance, when she drove those posts into my ground, she believed she'd already won. She believed the sight of signs, benches, and fresh gravel would be enough to make everyone assume it was legitimate. If it looks official, it must be official. That was her belief system. But she forgot the oldest rule about land. Ownership is not a rumor. Ownership is recorded. Ownership is mapped. Ownership is defended. She didn't walk onto a blank page. She walked into a place with boundaries older than her board, older than her neighborhood, older than her appetite for control. She thought she'd cornered me by showing up with crowds and cameras. She didn't know that every access point to that public park she fantasized about ran across roads I owned. She saw open land. I saw choke points. She saw community space. I saw trespass. She saw power. I saw overreach. And overreach always collapses under its own weight the second someone refuses to hold it up for free. I didn't beat HOA Karen by yelling louder. I beat her by knowing exactly where the truth was buried and digging until she tripped over it in public. The morning after she declared my land her community dog park, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, and every document that had ever touched this farm spread in front of me like a battlefield map. Deeds, plats, survey lines, easements, road rights, county filings, tax receipts, inheritance transfers, the entire paper spine of my land's history. My grandfather's signature lived on half of them. My father's on the rest, mine on the most recent. Paper doesn't brag, it doesn't threaten, it doesn't posture, it just sits there and waits to be presented in court. And when it is, people like Karen suddenly discover their authority was make-believe the entire time. I started with the basics: parcel numbers, boundary descriptions, legal coordinates written in tight surveyor's script. Every angle matched the land I'd walked my entire life. Then, I traced every road touching the property. The dirt tracks, the gravel lanes, the narrow ruts people think are public just because they've existed forever. Every single one of them ran across land titled in my family's name. Not the county, not the state, not some HOA fantasy jurisdiction. Mine. My grandfather had done that on purpose decades ago, buying up the strips the county didn't want because he understood something simple. It's easier to protect land when you own every way in and every way out. Karen had built her dream dog park inside a fortress she didn't realize belonged to me, and all I had to do was shut the gates she hadn't noticed. But before I closed anything, I wanted proof. Clean, undeniable, permanent. I drove to the county recorder's office with my folder under my arm. The clerks there had known my family for generations. They didn't give me special treatment. They gave me something better: records. Cold, impartial records that don't care about red suits or clipboards, or people who scream authority loud enough to scare the timid. We pulled up Crestwood HOA's charter. Expired? We pulled up their amended charter. Invalid. We pulled up their right-of-way maps. None. Not one legally recorded easement crossed my land in their name. They had exactly zero lawful access. Everything they'd done on my property existed on foundations of air. Then I looked up the permits Karen had waved around like holy scrolls. None existed in county databases, no approvals, no applications, not even a pending request. The documents she had flashed were self-made decorations, forged seals, fake letterheads, signatures from offices that didn't exist. She hadn't just bent rules. She'd walked into felony territory with heels on and a smile. I asked the clerk to certify copies of every record. She stamped them hard enough to echo. That sound was the sound of Karen's pretend empire cracking. But I wasn't finished. Paper records prove ownership. Video proves behavior. So I went home, pulled footage from the cameras I keep mounted around the property, and watched the timeline unfold frame by frame. I saw her cars roll in. I saw the fake officers step out. I saw her point at my land like a queen dividing property among peasants. I saw equipment unloaded, posts sunk, signs erected declaring public dog recreation zone, and I saw children and families walking onto my property under the lie she manufactured. Every second was time-stamped, every face visible, every command she gave recorded in clear audio. Evidence doesn't get angry. It just waits for court. I backed everything up 3 different ways: external drive, encrypted cloud, hard copy disks in a metal lockbox. People like her love to say, "There's no proof." I prefer to make so much proof, it buries the sentence before it's finished leaving their mouth. The final piece was financial. Power fantasies don't build dog parks. Money does. So I followed the money. Bank transfers tied to community projects, payments to contractors, fees labeled mandatory improvement contribution. Every cent led back to accounts controlled by one name: Karen. Not the board, not a committee, her. She wasn't just trying to steal my land. She was monetizing it before she even owned it, pre-selling ground she had no legal right to touch, like a con artist writing checks on someone else's account. I didn't rage. I didn't slam anything. I just felt everything click into place. This wasn't an argument anymore. It was a case. A clean, tight, airtight case that no amount of HOA theatrics could puncture. While she rehearsed speeches, I prepared filings. While she printed signs, I pulled statutes. While she recorded fake minutes, I gathered authenticated documents. She thought she had influence. I had proof. Proof that every road belonged to me. Proof that she had entered property without permission. Proof that she'd impersonated authority. Proof that she had extracted money under false representation. Proof that her power existed only as long as no one forced it into a courtroom. And that was where I was about to drag it with her, kicking the entire way, not because I was loud, but because the law doesn't care about volume. It cares about facts. I stacked the files into a single thick folder, heavier than it looked. That weight wasn't paper. That weight was consequence. I closed it and felt the shift inside myself. The farm had stopped being an inheritance to enjoy and returned to what it had always been for the men and women before me, something you stand between and those who would take it. That night, every light in my house burned until dawn, while I reviewed everything again line by line. Legal descriptions, recorded deeds, video logs, witness statements, financial transfers. A lifetime of law enforcement training guided every step, every piece labeled, every chain of custody preserved. Because when I walked into that courthouse, I wasn't going to make a scene. I was going to make history. When the sun finally rose, the decision was made. Karen had built a dog park on my farm. Too bad for her, I owned every road leading to it, every path her visitors walked, every inch her ego believed she'd conquered. And I was done explaining that politely. It was time to prove it under oath, under record, under penalty of perjury, with the same calm voice I'd used when I first told her she was trespassing. Only this time she wouldn't be standing in front of parked cars pretending to command anything. She'd be standing in front of a judge, and judges don't care about red suits. The courthouse lobby has a particular sound when something irreversible is about to happen. It isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It's the low hush of voices that know they are standing in a place where paper becomes consequence. I walked through those doors carrying the folder that held Karen's entire fantasy by the throat. She arrived 10 minutes later, red suit sharp, chin high, eyes already scanning for cameras like she was about to give a speech instead of face a reckoning. She saw me and tried to smirk, but her eyes betrayed the first flicker of doubt. People like Karen don't hear footsteps behind them until they're already too close to outrun. The clerk called our case. We stepped into the courtroom. Fluorescent lights, wood benches, a judge whose patience was measured in statute numbers rather than emotion. Karen tried to start with her performance, the same clipped tone she used in driveways and HOA meetings, reciting invented community authority as if repetition could turn fiction into law. The judge raised one eyebrow and told her to sit down. Then he turned to me. Proceed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't pace. I simply opened the folder and laid the truth out piece by piece, each document marked, each exhibit authenticated, every chain of custody intact, deeds showing ownership, surveys proving boundaries, recorded easements showing that every road touching the supposed dog park crossed my private land, certified letters from the county showing no permits existed, bank records tying her shell organizations back to her personal account, video footage of her ordering fake officers to arrest me on my own property. Each time another page was placed before the judge, Karen's world sagged a little further inward. For the first time since she'd stormed my farm, she was somewhere where tone couldn't save her. The law didn't bend when she glared at it. When it was her turn to respond, she reached for the only weapon she had ever owned: bluff. She claimed emergency authority. She claimed public necessity. She claimed implied consent. She claimed everything except the only thing that mattered: legality. The prosecutor asked a single question that cut through every excuse like wire through weeds. Ma'am, on what lawful authority did you enter and develop private agricultural land without recorded easement, permit, or court order? The silence that followed lasted forever. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. That was the moment the performance died. That was the moment the persona evaporated. Without her stage, she was just another person who thought loudness could substitute for law. The judge didn't raise his voice either. He simply read rulings into existence. Immediate cease and desist on all Crestwood HOA operations. Emergency injunction against entry onto my property by any party without my explicit written consent. Order to remove all structures and signage at her expense. Referral of forged documents for criminal review. Referral of financial records to state and federal authorities. Personal liability placed on her and any board member who facilitated the fraud. Each sentence landed like a locked gate closing behind her. She didn't collapse. That would have required honesty. Instead, she sat perfectly still, every inch of her posture trying to pretend she still had control, while the floor of that belief was sawed out from under her in real time. Outside the courtroom, the people she'd bullied for years were waiting, not cheering, not jeering, just watching. There is a very specific humiliation worse than shouting or insult being seen plainly. Karen walked out into a hallway full of people who finally understood that the queen they had feared never had a crown, just a loud voice and forged stationery. Her board members avoided her eyes. Contractors who had taken her orders stepped away. Even the friends she'd bragged about forgot how to stand near her. Collapse is quiet when it's real. On my way out, I didn't gloat. I didn't say a word to her. I simply signed the last document at the clerk's desk confirming service, because real power doesn't announce itself, it records itself. Reporters asked questions. I kept walking. Karen tried to call after me, tried to recover the tone she had used at my gate, but it wavered and broke halfway out of her throat. Authority isn't clothing, and she had just discovered she had none once the costume was stripped. By sundown, the injunction orders had reached every entity she controlled. Accounts frozen, projects halted, access revoked. Contractors pulled their equipment back. Signs declaring community park came down one after another, each unbolted piece another piece of her imaginary kingdom being physically dismantled in public view. And then came the final turn of the knife, the roads. The sheriff's office served formal notice that all access routes crossing my land were private, closed, and legally enforced under trespass law. Her dog park didn't just lose legitimacy, it lost entrances and exits. She had built her monument to control inside a box she did not own, and now the walls were visible to everyone. The next HOA meeting was supposed to be her stage. It became her execution ground not by anger, not by threat, but by resignation letters slamming onto a table from board members no longer willing to sync with her. They turned on her the way followers always do when fear stops working. The financial backers vanished. The fake cops lawyered up. The community she had ruled by intimidation watched her stand at the front of a room she no longer commanded and shake as the last illusion cracked all the way through. She had wanted applause. She got minutes recorded for court instead. The public collapse wasn't explosive. It was surgical. Titles evaporated. Access vanished. Authority dissolved. She walked in believing she could take land because she declared it hers. She walked out learning that roads, deeds, and law don't care who talks the loudest. And when the echo of the gavel faded and the courthouse doors closed behind us, she finally understood the sentence she had mocked the first day we met. Too bad for you, Karen. I own every road in and every road out. There is a difference between winning a confrontation and finishing a problem. Court humiliated her, yes. Stripped the costume off the role she'd been playing, yes. But people like HOA Karen don't stop because a judge told them to. They stop when there is nothing left for them to stand on. That was the work ahead of me. Now not anger, not revenge, just precision. Retaliation, in the expert sense, means putting things back where they belong and locking them there. The morning after the injunction, my phone became a switchboard. County council, state investigators, federal auditors. What Karen had treated as a petty neighborhood game was now beating through systems designed to trace money, authority, and fraud to their last hiding places. I provided everything they needed, not with speeches, not with drama, just with documentation. Every letter she'd sent, every fake fine, every shell company invoice, every transfer routed through her development account. Evidence is patient in a way loud people never are. It waits, and then it crushes. She attempted one last maneuver before the walls closed entirely. She emailed residents begging support, painting herself as the victim of a rogue landowner and overreaching officials. But fear was gone now. People she'd intimidated for years forwarded those emails straight to investigators. The illusion had broken. When fear breaks, obedience breaks with it. My role from that point wasn't loud. It was technical. I filed quiet motions to secure permanent easements in my name where roads crossed my land, converting decades of informal respect into ironclad legal boundaries. I met with county surveyors and locked every corner post in GPS records, so no map trick could ever pretend my fields belonged to someone else again. I set up recorded notices of trespass for Crestwood's dissolved organization so there would never again be confusion over who held authority here. Retaliation, done right, doesn't raise its voice. It signs its name. Karen, meanwhile, discovered that the systems she had bullied could push back harder than she had ever imagined. Her accounts froze, her shell companies flagged, her allies stopped returning calls. The banks that once smiled at her paperwork now treated those same documents like radioactive waste. Every fraudulent filing triggered another audit. Every forged seal triggered another charge review. She tried to rally what remained of her board, but fear runs both ways, and now it was looking at her. One by one they resigned, each letter distancing themselves from the actions of President Hollis, each signature another step away from the wreckage she had created. The dog park remained fenced off, equipment removed, entrances locked by me and by law, an empty field of trampled grass and abandoned plans a monument to her fantasy and its failure. Reporters kept calling. I kept saying no. Satisfaction doesn't come from microphones. It comes from silence where noise used to be. The federal investigators arrived with their quiet professionalism, asking questions she couldn't outrun, producing records she couldn't talk over. They traced money. They traced authority claims. They traced the web she wove and followed every thread to her hands. She had built her empire on paperwork. Now, paperwork was taking it apart, clause by clause, signature by signature. Through it all, I continued my life. Fences repaired, fields mowed, roads graded. The land didn't care about her noise, and neither did I. That was the deepest retaliation of all the refusal to revolve around her anymore. She had stormed onto my farm believing control came from volume and proximity to fear. What broke her was learning that real control comes from ownership, record, lineage, and law layered so solidly that no one can pretend over it again. By the time the investigators finished and the prosecutors took over, there was nothing left for her to grab. No title with weight. No account with movement. No audience willing to pretend. Consequences moved forward without shouting or theatrics. Notices served. Restitution calculated. Charges drafted. There was no dramatic confrontation in a parking lot. No screaming match on a driveway. Just a woman discovering that every avenue she thought she could run down was on land she didn't own, controlled by laws she couldn't bend, ending in doors that would not open for her anymore. Expert retaliation, in the end, wasn't about punishing. It was about sealing the system she exploited so tightly that no one like her could do it again. It was roads recorded, deeds defended, authority realigned. It was the transformation of her arrogance into case law and reform. And when the last document was signed, when the final boundary marker was set, when every road in and out of my property was legally and publicly confirmed as mine alone, there was nothing left for her to push against except the truth she had spent years avoiding. She had tried to build a kingdom on my land. I answered by making sure the land could never be stolen again. And when it was finished, there was no noise, no celebration, no raised fist, just quiet, and the knowledge that the story was moving toward its final, unavoidable end. Victory doesn't arrive with trumpets. It shows up in small, undeniable details. Gates that stay closed when you decide they do. Phones that stop ringing with threats. A name spoken in the past tense by people who once said it like a command. Weeks after the last filing was stamped and the last boundary recorded, the noise around Karen faded the way storms do when they have exhausted themselves. She wasn't a headline anymore. She wasn't a presence. She was just the echo of a mistake that had hit bedrock. Life on the farm returned to what it had been before she decided my land was a stage for her performance. Mornings were early again, not because of urgency, but because that's when work belongs to the world. Dew on the fence line, gravel settling under tires I chose to bring in. The barn doors creaked the same way they always had, unconcerned with courtrooms and injunctions. Land remembers who actually tends it. That is a language she never learned. The last visible trace of her ambition lay where the fake dog park had once been declared with signs and bravado. Now it was just ground again, grass reclaiming ruts, posts pulled, Nothing left except the faint outlines of plains that never belonged here. People asked if I would build something there to mark what happened. I didn't. Leaving it plain was the mark. Emptiness where she tried to impose herself said more than monuments ever could. Word filtered quietly through town about her final outcome charges proceeding. Accounts gone, titles stripped, the life she had constructed out of intimidation collapsing inward until all that remained was paperwork with her name on it and no authority attached. I didn't attend the last hearing. I didn't need to. Once the roads were legally mine, once the land was sealed, once the community no longer listened when she raised her voice, the rest was just gravity finishing what it always finishes. Neighbors who had once flinched at her name stopped doing so. They waved again when they passed my truck. Some brought thanks, some brought nothing but a nod. Both meant the same thing: fear had finally been evicted. The sheriff stopped by one evening, leaned against the same gate where she once shouted about community control, and said quietly. The closed gate and the quiet road behind it were enough confirmation. Sunsets changed, not in color, but in weight. There was no pressure hiding behind the tree line anymore, no expectation of confrontation under the next cloud of dust, just light, distance, and the low sound of wind moving where it always had. That was victory. Not noise, not applause. Control returning to the place it belonged. On the night it finally settled in completely, I walked every road that leads into this land. The gravel, the dirt, the narrow cattle trail everyone forgets is still technically a right-of-way. Every one of them mine, recorded, uncontested, unchallengeable. She had tried to invade through them. Now they were lines she could not cross in reality or memory. At the north fence, I stopped and looked back at the farm. The barn stood dark against the fading sky, the same silhouette my grandfather had known, the same one my father had worked under, untouched by all of her declarations. That was the truth she had broken herself against without ever understanding it. Authority isn't declared. It's inherited through responsibility, guarded through patience, proven through time. She mistook volume for power and paperwork for ownership. In the end, she didn't lose to me. She lost to the land, to the quiet endurance of something that doesn't respond to shouting or forgery. No speeches, no final confrontation, no dramatic collapse. Just absence, the absence of her voice, her signs, her presence, her imagined control. A kingdom dissolved into nothing because it had never existed anywhere except in her need to be obeyed. I closed the last gate and latched it. Not hard, not with ceremony, just firmly. The metal clicked in the still air. That was the ending. Not words, not explanations. A boundary closing exactly where it belonged and staying there because I said so. Somewhere beyond the ridge, she was facing whatever remained of the consequences she had summoned for herself. Here, there was only quiet. The dogs lay down by the porch. The wind moved through the field. The roads in and out waited, mine in title and in fact. And as darkness settled across the farm she tried to claim, there was nothing left to add. HOA Karen had built a dog park on my land, thinking she owned the way in. She learned, finally and completely, that every way in and every way out already belonged to me.